And so getting a confidence in being a child of God again, and to be able to look in someone in the eye, not arrogantly, but if someone laughs at me and says, "Oh, you're a Christian," I'm like, "Yeah, I am a Christian." So the semiotic is a sign of that confidence. It's a humble confidence. It's not an arrogance, but I reckon it's one of the preliminary steps to evangelism, actually, to encourage people to be confident to be Christian.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Shock Absorber podcast. It is fantastic to have you along with us as well. And as always, it's fantastic to have my two usual co-hosts along with me. Tim, how are you?
I'll go very well. Thanks, Joel.
Excellent.
I really like that dramatic head movement when you looked at us.
Yeah, well, you can only see that on YouTube, guys.
That's
Stop
true.
listening and watch it on YouTube if you want to see that. It's very impressive. Thank you.
I was impressed.
I was about to ask how you are, Stu, but then you took a sip of coffee.
I'm really well.
Are you?
I've had a good week.
Yeah, you're looking rugged up there. It looks very warm. That
quite warm.
blue. I don't know how you describe that material.
Is it
Is
that bit of a
flannelette?
retro surfer sort of thing from the 90s, sort of, they brought it back again. I found it really quite comfy and warm. It's good.
Oh, great. Well, I'm glad you brought up the 90s because we're talking about Soul Revival, which began in the 90s.
1992.
Yep, and we're this year is the 30th year anniversary of Soul Revival since it started in 1992, which is fantastic. And also, as we always like to always talk about a story or a cultural artifact, we're going to start with Tim's jumper today because that says Soul Revival on it. And we were going to begin with that, but we're also going to talk about the numerous cultural artifacts that kind of came out of the last 30 years of Soul Revival Church and how it affected our evangelism, because we are talking about whatever happened to evangelism as our season. Soul Revival, that's the latest jumper so far. There is another jumper coming out, which the team have put together. But why, Stu, things like Tim's jumper, and Tim can speak to this too, of course, is why do you think they're so important to Soul Revival for us to have?
Yeah, so there's been a bit of a love-hate relationship with things like cultural artifacts within the Christian Protestant church in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Some people see things like a Soul Revival jumper as merch, or just a bit tacky, like some people used to call it Jesus junk. Like all the stickers like "honk if you love Jesus" on the back of someone's car, stuff like that. And I must admit, sometimes semiotics can get out of hand, but there is a place for them. I think it's helpful as a cultural marker to say that we are really excited about being part of a community which is part of the global universal church, and it's really exciting to be a Christian. And sometimes it's great to have creative expressions of community. Now, Colossians, we read that we're to be clothed in Christ, so we don't need any outward representation of who we are as Christians, although right through history Christians have had cultural semiotics. As an Anglican pastor, I know that traditionally Anglican pastors have worn collars, different kinds of collars to other people to designate their office, just like there are cultural artifacts in other parts of the world. When we started Soul Revival Church, we thought it would be great to not only consume cultural artifacts but also to create cultural artifacts and produce some things that are fun for people in the community to wear, because it just gets conversation going. People say, "Oh, what's that?" Or it's actually also another way of saying, "Yeah, I'm really excited about being part of this." So yeah, there's a lot of really good reasons to have some what we call semiotics, which is a symbolism. The study of semiotics says that everybody has some kind of symbolism that sort of they use to articulate who they are a little bit. So the study of semiotics says even the lack of a semiotic is a semiotic in itself. So some Christians would say, "Oh, I don't want to wear any Christian gear," but that in itself is saying something about that person as well. So, but lots of cultures have different semiotics. I mean, you mentioned this jumper; it's a Quicksilver jumper, and it's a surf brand, and they've kind of gone back to their past as a bit of a semiotic to talk about the continuity of that sport with the present, and that there's been earlier generations that have worn labels, I suppose some people call it. And yeah, you know, some people don't like labels and they say that's a bit tacky, but again, the lack of a label is a label in itself too. So I had a friend, I've actually still got this friend who will never wear labels. He always wears a t-shirt with nothing on it because he doesn't want to advertise any company or whatever. But that says a lot about him. So he's the kind of guy who doesn't like labels. So the way we went with the semiotics is we just encouraged, again with the shock absorber, we call this podcast the shock absorber, and we talk to young people about what they think is a fun idea, and young people come up with fun ideas. And part of that is sometimes ideas of spaces we can create or things we can do together. But it's also sometimes creative things, like someone has a design that they've designed and we think, let's put that on a t-shirt, that's fun. So it's not really about trying to make money, although the jumper Tim's wearing, if we do make any profits from these clothes these days, we send the profits to our Indigenous partnerships in Western New South Wales, which is great. So there's a purpose for that too, which is good. But I think it's a nice confident thing to do, to say, yeah, I'm really excited about being a surfer. I might buy a surf shirt, like a Billabong shirt or a Quicksilver. I'm really excited about my community. I'm really quite stoked to be able to wear something that says the name of my community on it, so that people go, oh, what's that?
Yeah, the idea of semiotics is interesting, isn't it? It's like whatever you choose to wear is still saying something about you. I remember an interview with one of my favourite bands called The Hives.
Yep,
and
they're a great band.
And they all wear suits on stage.
Yes, they do.
And then
that's a semiotic.
And the interviewer was asking them, there's some other bands that say aren't doing anything about themselves, and they wear like more like whatever they want on stage. The singer of The Hives goes, well, they're doing exactly the opposite to what we're doing. They're still saying something about themselves. So that makes a lot of sense what you're saying.
And we don't want to, like, you don't take something like that and just say it's just about starting a conversation, although it can. It's also about encouraging a confidence amongst particularly young Christians, because we've talked in previous podcasts about the fact that we think that particularly Australian Christians who've grown up in Christian families, sometimes go on to Christian schools, can sometimes have a bit of a cultural cringe where they feel not as cool as the rest of society, or they feel like a bit embarrassed being Christian. Christians in high school sometimes, that are state schools, sometimes want to keep their heads down. So when Christians see someone confident enough to wear something that has some kind of Christian semiotic, they're like, oh, that's encouraging me to be confident in my faith and stand a bit, I remember someone saying to me once that, I think it was a talk I went to once, I don't remember where, but someone was saying, if you were the prince and of England and your mother was the Queen of England, if someone went up to you and went, oh, are you a prince? You go, actually, yeah, I am. My mother's the Queen. And you wouldn't look down. If someone laughed at you for being a prince, you wouldn't look down. And yet the speaker said, but we're the children of the King of the universe. But when people laugh at us for being Christians, sometimes we look down. And so getting a confidence in being a child of God again, and to be able to look someone in the eye, not arrogantly, but if someone laughs at me and says, oh, you're a Christian, I'm like, yeah, I am a Christian. So the semiotic is a sign of that confidence. It's a humble confidence. It's not an arrogance, but I reckon it's one of the preliminary steps to evangelism, actually, to encourage people to be confident to be Christian. That means we already have a confident stance that's humble, but not aggressive or arrogant. But it's not cringy, going, oh yeah, I am a Christian. I'm a bit daggy, aren't I?
Is it like a willingness to wear that to show that, like, I am part of a Christian community?
It's a confidence, yeah. And when you think about how we're portrayed in the media, we're often portrayed as either really rude and arrogant, or really dangerous and hateful, or on the other spectrum, just really meek and mild. It's good to be humble, but the media just portrays us to be people who don't have anything to say. So if we can give our young people a bit of a confidence being Christian in their particular community, then people can benefit from that, because it's like, oh, you're confident enough to wear a shirt that says something about your church. Even if someone laughs and goes, oh, that's a bit daggy, go, okay, if you think it's daggy, that's cool. If someone laughs at me for wearing a surf shirt, I'm going to go, okay, I'm quite happy, and being part of that subculture doesn't bother me. So yeah, that's kind of where this can be a really helpful tool for us in ministry.
Tim, is that we have talked about it before about the Jesus beads, and that's something that was helping people to be confident Christians in their wherever they were, usually at school, especially in Soul Revival. I was just wondering if you had a particular one at Soul Revival that you really liked.
A particular T-shirt or something?
T-shirt or any kind of semiotic,
yeah. Well, we did talk right at the start of this season. I think it was our first episode where it was just you and I, Joel, and we talked about the Jesus beads, and that was a really significant one. Significant both because it was well used amongst our community. Like we use those colours a lot. And people wore them, and we had flags, and it was quite a large demonstration of this is who we are. So it was quite a powerful semiotic because it was so well used. The other powerful thing about the Jesus beads was it is not just a simple semiotic like, honk if you love Jesus, beep your horn if you love Jesus kind of bumper sticker, but it actually in itself tells the story. And so we're using it all the time, and we would use it all the time in youth ministry and in children's ministry and just in chatting with people on the street about, well, this is the gospel story. This is the Jesus story that we're living into. And the reason I'm wearing it is because I identify with that story. That is the story that shapes me and that I believe in. And so there's a number of things going on there. It was quite a simple but also complex semiotic, so I really liked it for that. And it's one that I still use now, particularly in the children's ministry that I do. If you can remember 5 colours, you can know the whole Jesus story, and everything else is just detail. And so that's a really helpful way of articulating the gospel to people. So yeah, I really like that one. I mean, I'm sure that I've had plenty of Soul Revival stickers and bumper stickers and T-shirts and hats.
We
and
even did
things.
a CD at one stage, didn't we? A little magazine. And
Yeah, we did magazines.
Videos.
We did video magazines.
Those CDs are still left over somewhere, aren't
Yes,
they?
we,
There's so many
we
boxes.
ordered a lot of them. The minimum order was 500, and everyone's like, "We're not going to get rid of 500." And me being an optimist as usual, went, "Yeah, man, we'll get rid of 500." And it's still actually. One of the 13-year-olds came up to me last week with a CD. She's like, "What's this?" And I said, "Oh, that's one of the CDs we made for Soul Revival." She says, "What's a CD?" So she wasn't asking, "What's this Soul Revival CD?"
No,
She didn't
what's
even
this
know
weird silver disc?
She didn't even know
What
what
do
a
you do with
disc
that?
was. Yeah.
Yeah.
The one I was thinking of was, I can't remember when I saw it, and I don't know if it was part of Fly Mag, which was back
That's what we called our magazine.
It was but was it wasn't, so that was the
video magazine.
It was a video
So
magazine.
Sick Mag was the printed. We had these
Yeah.
printed, kind of signs that we would give out, and then we moved to video and called it the Fly Mag.
Yeah, which was really it must have been a Fly Mag, and then it was a thing called Secret Agent Dooley.
Yeah, because there was a guy called Scott
Dooley, wasn't it? Yeah. It was how to be a secret agent, but he would just
he went to Vinnie's and got himself a suit and wore a T-shirt and this suit, the ill-fitting suit.
Yeah, and he just slammed himself in a door multiple times. I remember that. It was like how to enter a room or something.
The whole vibe was he just ran into things. Yeah, it was really
So I
clumsy.
must have been in year 10 or something.
You
And I
must have
thought that
been,
was
yeah.
hilarious.
Yeah, we all.
Another one of those Fly Mag segments that I remember was it must have been 2000. So it was the year the Olympics were coming to Sydney, and the Olympic torch was part of its route was to run down the main street of Guyamere, which is where our church was.
Yeah.
And so there was security who had blocked off this street, stopped all the traffic. There were people behind barricades just lining the street to see, the Olympic torch
Probably
run
1,000
through.
people actually.
Yeah, run through our suburb. It was really exciting. It's really close to the Sydney Olympic Park. We're getting really close to the start of the games, and while we're all standing there, a couple of people jump up with this massive Soul Revival flag that has the 5 gospel colours on it, the Jesus bead colours on it, and just kind of runs down the main street through this gauntlet of all these people.
Before the
Before the
flame
torch
came,
could come through, yeah.
We ran down. People thought it was part of the Olympics, so they all started clapping. So we're all laughing because people thought it was part of the Olympics.
Yeah.
Look at these athletes.
And it was just fun because there was this, there was this confidence, I think, of just saying we're Christians and we're having fun and it wasn't I think now 22 years later, people would interpret that as highly political because in the last 20 years things have become really hyper politicized. But it wasn't
disrespectful,
disrespectful,
maybe, or
yeah.
something like that, yeah.
And it wasn't any of that. There was no political agenda. There was no. It was just a joyful fun. Of just being Christians and just kind of celebrating and who we were and the flag and the semiotic of the 5 colours that tell the Jesus story was just part of that.
The good thing about semiotics is they can change a bit over time. Like back in 1992, we made our first T-shirts and just because we wanted to, because we were really excited about being Soul Revival, and there was only 10 of us at the time. And then, over time we do different things. The Jesus beads came along. I mean, the whole shock absorber thing about, young people, listening to young people, it was actually 16-year-olds that came up with the Jesus beads, and they said, this is a great idea, let's use that. But that can change and morph over time. I mean, recently I was talking to someone a couple of weeks ago who said they're really interested in using the Jesus beads, but they're a bit worried about black and white because, green is God created the world. Black is that when we sinned... Oh, sorry. Green is God created. I've been using them for 30 years and I forgot the order. Green is God created the world. White is He's made us to be His friend and we walk in the light. So the white represents the light. And the black is the darkness that when sin comes, we can't see God anymore in the darkness. And then red is that Jesus' blood washes us clean so we can see God again because He is God. And then yellow is that we can have new life in Christ now and into eternity. And some people have rightly... talked about why is white and black used symbolically in that, and some people have said, in our day and age, again, Tim, with the politics of the world we're in, some people have said, is black representing skin colour and white skin colour? Maybe that's problematic. I've even heard on Christian podcasts they've actually gone into a big diagnostic about that and how, is the Jesus bead idea actually fundamentally racist because, people who used it didn't see the racism of the white and the black. And I was concerned about that. So I talked to some of my friends who are Indigenous pastors one time about it. And they said, well, when they've heard us talk about the Jesus beads, they really resonated with the light and darkness because even in Aboriginal culture, light and darkness are really strong semiotics of good and evil. It's not white and black skin colour. But having said that, I was talking to someone a couple of weeks ago who was like, it's still, I'd like to use the Jesus beads, but it does conjure up issues for some people who think maybe that could be seen as racist. But the great thing about a semiotic is, you can modify it. If there's a problem with it, you can change it and it can grow and change. And that's the whole idea of the shock absorber, that if young people today are saying, this could be seen as a racist thing, well, let's change it because there's no need to cause offence with anything other than the gospel. So if there's anything that we're doing as Christians that cause offence, well, unless it's something we think we can speak to and have an apologetic for, there's nothing wrong with changing black to dark grey, because you could actually think of that theologically, that while our sin causes darkness and we can't, and there's darkness motif right through the whole Bible, but the reality is even though we live in the darkness of sin and we're dead in our sins and transgressions, as it says in Ephesians chapter 2, we live in the darkness. Jesus brought the light, as particularly John talks about a lot, and that we're children of the light. But you could kind of argue using grey that, yes, we're living in darkness, but God hasn't completely withdrawn His presence from the world, and there is the light of the gospel. And there's two. It just occurred to me as I'm talking. Actually, Romans 1 says that the creation is there so that we could see God. It's not it's not going to lead us to salvation, but we can still see that there is a God because we can see what He's made. That He's made all this amazing stuff. But the other thing we could also talk about is using grey instead of black, is we could talk about the fact that even though there's a darkness of sin in the world, God chose for Himself a people. And that might be a really nice way for people to use biblical theology to talk about the place of the story of the people of Israel in the lead up to Jesus. Because one of the limitations of the Jesus beads is it goes from Genesis to Matthew straight away. And it probably would be really good to talk about how Jesus came from a people and the place of Israel in that story. So grey would really do that quite well. Now, when I've had those conversations with people at Soul Revival, they've often been really attached to the colours that we've got because we've used them for so long, like Tim said. But I think we're probably going to migrate to that sort of a vibe too, that, getting a charcoal or a grey, that might work really well. So then it's like, that's one possibility. But I don't know, listeners and viewers might come up with a better idea and let us know, because that's part of what we're going to talk about today. We're all doing this together and we're learning from each other. Yeah.
Sorry, did you have something on that, Tim? I thought you were going to say something.
Oh, no, I mean, the other thing I was just thinking, what's
Tim,
the biblical language around this? And because, as Stu said, you want to cause offence. If there is going to be offence, you want it to be the gospel, not because of some tool that you've used. And so, go back to what's the language of the Bible. And yes, we do talk. John's gospel really strongly talks about the difference between darkness and light. That if that was an emphasis, you could talk about that. But Isaiah talks about our sin being scarlet, and so but then in that particular semiotic red is usually used as, the blood of Christ or the love of Christ, tying those two things together. So, I think it's helpful to think through those things. And yes, if there is offence being caused, or if it's going to be a blockage to the gospel, and this is what we've talked about throughout this season, we want to, the evangelistic through line that we've tried to talk about is trying to strip away the things that may distract people from hearing the clear gospel message of Jesus. And so if people are hearing something else, then it's like we can try and explain that away. It's always helpful to have these in conversations. We've talked about those kinds of things. But also, it's just a tool. As long as we then have something else, we're actually still evangelizing, then it doesn't really matter what the tool is, as long as we're actually getting on with, telling the nations about Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
I'll just bring it back a little bit to, we're talking about soul revival artifacts. Do you remember some of those things that we talked about, people using them directly as a way to evangelize?
Well, the good thing about when we first started the Jesus beads is they were literally beads people wore on their wrists. So teenage Christians would wear them to school in a state school where there's not many Christians. And so it had two effects. One was that if a Christian saw another Christian wearing Jesus beads, it'd put a smile on their face and encourage older teenage Christians to appropriately mentor younger teenage Christians by just giving them a bit of confidence. So if a young Christian in year 7 saw a year 12 kid wearing Jesus beads, they're like, oh, okay, because they look up to older teenagers. Yeah. Second thing was they'd be in class and someone would say, what's with the Jesus beads? And, I remember back in high school, I never was confident to share the gospel because I was always worried I'd get it wrong. And so I'd sort of I might miss something out or I might misrepresent God. I don't feel confident to share the gospel because I don't have a confidence in a framework that I can share it within a framework. And some people go overboard with evangelistic tools and they use them verbatim and it can be a bit clunky. But what was good about the Jesus beads is simply wearing these beads, which by the way was culturally fashionable at the time in the 90s too, people wearing beads a lot around their wrists and stuff. Not so much these days. But basically, a kid would see someone in maths wearing Jesus beads and at the end of the lesson they might go, what's with the coloured beads? And the kid, by being asked that question, could go, well, green represents this, white represents this, black represents this, red, and they just told their friend the gospel. And what was great about that is I got feedback time and time again that a lot of teenagers didn't laugh or think that was silly. They just went, oh, that's interesting. So you actually believe that? Yeah, I do actually. Oh, cool. Because of the confidence of wearing it, the person actually approach the Christian from a different point of view. So there's this cultural milieu, I don't know how to say that word, or
milieu,
something like that. We should get more sophisticated on this podcast and have a better grasp of the English language. But there's a setup between the conversation you have between a secularist and a Christian. There's this expected framework, and it deconstructed that framework into a opportunity for a serious conversation. And what I mean by that, I was watching Hard Chat the other day and a pastor was on Hard Chat.
Oh, really?
It's if you don't know what Hard Chat is, it's a fun ABC show about people who have a particular interest. It's like a game show and they get questions on their interests, like might be Back to the Future or rugby league or whatever, and they get something that they're interested in and they get questions on it, and it's just a bit of fun.
Hosted by Tom Gleeson.
Yeah, that's right. I think I've done it justice for listeners that are not aware of it. But anyway, if you're interested, you could look it up on the internet, Hard Chat. But anyway, there was a pastor on Hard Chat, and his interest was the Bible. And even Tom Gleeson laughed and he went, that's a big book. Like, you really want to use this as your special interest topic? Yeah. And he's like, yeah. So he pretty much didn't get anything right. It was hilarious. And everyone kept stealing all these questions. But the pastor was really good because Tom Gleeson was just getting into him straight away. Like, it was almost like, oh, here's the Christian, we can play ball, let's go. So he's like making jokes about sin and judge. Oh, you must be a really judgy person, and because it's Hard Chat is the whole thing. The shtick of it is that you pay out the person. And I was just watching that, going, yeah, that's kind of like a microcosm of how secular people think that's how you talk to Christians, because we're boring or we're a bit stodgy or whatever. But the Jesus beads was like deconstructing that, because for a time, like, it probably doesn't do the same thing now, but kids were like able to say, yeah, I'm into that, and kids were like, oh, okay, cool. And if they weren't interested, they just went, yeah, I respect that. And there was a bit more of a conversation around it, which was cool.
Yeah, I think it social psychologists will talk about the idea of a plausibility structure, which is the idea that in a particular society there are some beliefs that are easy to believe and others that are harder to believe. And so if you feel like you're like that pastor on Hard Chat and you're kind of there and the entire studio is against you and just paying you out and you're just there trying to be the only Christian, and that's really difficult. There's not a plausibility structure on that show that validates a Christian understanding of the world. Actually, all of the structures, all of the undercurrents and assumptions of that show, and you assume most of the audience who are watching it is this person's, nutty. They're a real fringe person. Only fringe people would be interested in the Bible. We actually have call themselves a Christian, etc. And for the teenager to be in a high school and feel like their high school is like Hard Chat and feel like they're just this lone person. There's no teachers, there's no students, there's all of the subjects are taught in such a way, the conversations that happen, all of those, either implicitly or explicitly, are all against Christianity, or at least see it as a weird fringe thing. And so what the Jesus beads did, particularly in those late 90s, early 2000s, when there were quite a significant number of teenagers at some of our local high schools wearing them, is it starts to create this plausibility structure. You actually realise you've got other people who are in this school who are like you. And suddenly that becomes a little bit easier to believe. It's a little bit easier to know that I'm not alone in this, that there are other people who are also bold enough to wear their faith to Jesus on their sleeve, literally on their wrist or on their shoe or on their bag or something. And so that gives a plausibility structure and it strengthens the faith of those who are there. But it also creates a plausibility structure for the non-Christian kids who are there, because they realise that there's not just this one fringe person in the entire high school of hundreds and hundreds of people, kind of like this one pastor on Hard Chat, and it's then easy to pay that person out or think them as weird, when actually you look around and it might only be 10% of your school population, but if you've got 10% of your school population who are all saying, yeah, we're Christians and we're confident enough in our Christianity to wear it on our sleeves, and suddenly you've got all of the non-Christians who see that it's not just weird and fringe, it's actually quite a substantial number of their school population who believe in this stuff, and that softens the attitude. So you will get more conversations like, oh, you guys believe that? Oh, that's kind of cool. Like, oh, that's interesting. It's different. And so it may or it may not lead to gospel conversations, therefore conversions, and obviously we hope that in God's grace will happen, and there's ways in which we help structure around that with other things we'll talk about, the chip lunch and being confident in SRE classes and those kinds of things, invites from chip lunch back to what was happening on a church site, all of those kinds of things. But even when it doesn't, you've still got a lot of people who don't claim faith in Jesus who realise they have friends or classmates who are friends with Jesus, and that brings the tone of the conversation down. And I think a large part of some of the hostility we may face in the cultural conversation is there's a lot of people who either don't know a Christian or don't know that they know a Christian. And so it's easy to, make them an other, to look at them as something strange. There's this weird little group out there somewhere called Christians. I don't know anyone. I've never met one. I don't interact with them. And so I don't really understand them. And so these semiotics that actually just confidently display, not rudely, not aggressively, but just say really gently but confidently, yeah, I'm a Christian. I believe in this stuff. And all of a sudden people may realise, they've actually got a neighbour or a work colleague or someone who's sitting across from them on the train that believes in Jesus. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. There's actually more Christians around than I realised. Maybe it's not as fringe as I've thought to believe in my little bubble where I've never interacted with a Christian.
That's a good point.
Is that something in your ministries of having your conversations with people of what you've heard? We talked about the Jesus beads being in the 90s and the 2000s being something really important and helpful to creating that plausibility structure. I remember when people were putting on their skate shoes, for example. I don't think I did that. I think I had a bracelet, but even so, what do you think the version of that is today?
Well, that's what's really exciting about this conversation, because if we, there's more to say than just semiotics, but the the confident thing, if you start with that, is how do we build confidence in young people and in our church members? Now, when we first started with the Jesus Beads in the early 90s, the incarnational impulse was that Christians should be trying harder to be a part of the culture rather than being a distinct culture. So we were seen as this strange anomaly within a lot of youth ministry circles in the 90s, where a lot of youth ministry was about, well, wear skater clothes, go to a skate park, or go surfing with surfers and wear surf clothes and don't look any different to them. But I remember one of our young crew watched a movie called Point Break, and it's a fantastic movie. I love it. It's Keanu Reeves, probably my favourite Keanu Reeves movie. And some people hate Keanu Reeves, but I think he's fantastic. But anyway, Keanu Reeves is this detective, and he's got to infiltrate this gang of surfers in Point Break, and he has to learn how to surf and pretend to be a surfer. And he's an FBI agent. He's the clunkiest surfer ever. And he walks into this surf shop, and there's this 12-year-old kid behind the counter, and he goes, "Oh, I want to learn to surf." And he's like 25 or something in the movie, and the kid goes, "It's never too late to learn to surf." And then Keanu Reeves calls him a little rubbery person, and he goes, this really awkward interaction. And then he takes this pink board down to the beach, and he thinks he's fitting in, but he's standing out like a dog's dinner. And he paddles out, and all the surfers just laugh at him and go, "Who is this kook?" Like, he looked like a policeman. And one of the young crew at our church, we all used to laugh at that movie and think it was terrific. And one of the young crew said, "Youth ministers are a bit like Keanu Reeves. That you guys go to the surf shop, you buy your pink surfboard, and you come down the beach with us, and you hang out and you try and look like us. And we can spot you a mile off that you're actually nothing like us, and it's kind of daggy. You might as well just be yourself." And I remember thinking, I'd already thought about doing that anyway, but I was thinking that was a reinforcement to me that maybe that's not the incarnational approach of being cool and hip and wearing the right, Pearl Jam t-shirt and hanging out at the skate park or whatever. Maybe that's not the only way to do evangelism, that maybe another way could be for me to walk in as a Christian to a context and say, "Yeah, I'm a Christian, I've got a Bible here," even. Like, that's a semiotic in itself, a Bible. So I used to take a Bible to Scripture, and it was really interesting that kids really respected that authenticity. And I felt encouraged in that by bands like Nirvana. Like, the guys that came out of Seattle was like a breath of fresh air in the midst of all this, glam rock from the 90s and all these, pouty kind of guys with big hair and tight
and
leather
makeup
pants and makeup,
eyeliner,
and singing about partying all the time. Yeah. And then all of a sudden Kurt Cobain gets up on stage with his pajamas on and starts singing about how bad the world is, and everyone's like, "Oh, this is cool." And apparently when Nirvana started, all those bands went, "Okay, our era is over." They just knew for sure that was it. I remember reading in Rolling Stone about how INXS had this massive crisis. INXS was a big band from the 80s, and when grunge came along, they're like, "Do we need to become grunge?" And some of the members just went, "No, this is it, we're gone, it's over." So I thought that was an interesting thing, because as Christians, we're trying to fit into each of the cultures, and we're trying to do that out of love, because we want to take away any barriers to the gospel that people might have. But in trying to be like those people, we're actually maybe not really able to do that seamlessly, because at a point you can affirm a culture up to a point, but sooner or later you've got to actually talk about sin for the people in that culture and the culture itself. So when do you do that within that incarnational form? One last thing I'd say on that is, in the 90s too, I was reading up on the Black Panther movement that was in the 1960s, which was an Oakland-based young African-American movement against police violence. And these Black Panthers actually were growing up in homes where their parents, who were African-American, were straightening their hair, wearing suits like white people, trying to look like white people, and they were trying to live in a white world by looking like white people. But they were never white because they were African-American. And so their children in the 60s went, "Why are we even trying to look white? Why don't we just get our hair to be big and bold and beautiful, and let's put an African comb in our hair, and let's wear African clothes." And some of them called themselves African names, and they just really imbibed this thing. And the theory they had was that there's this theory called hegemony that is that when a minority thinks that it can succeed by adapting to the majority, it's actually believing a lie that is perpetuating, saying that you can be successful in this culture if you be like us, but if you're not like us, then we'll always keep you at arm's length. And so the Black Panther Party were like, well, let's just be African American, let's not try and be white. And I remember reading about that in the 90s thinking there's a little bit of a crossover with Christians, because part of wanting to go into the culture and be a surfer to the culture, we love Christian surfers here at Soul Revival, but to be a Christian surfer is a bit, there is the danger of hegemony that maybe we'll be a bit more like Keanu Reeves in Point Break rather than Mark Occhilupo from Cronulla, who's a world champion surfer, because at a point we are distinct and we're different. So what Soul Revival started to try and experiment with in the 90s and has continued on to this day is whatever form it takes, like however we use semiotics or not use semiotics. It might just be that our distinctiveness is we believe the Bible and we preach the Bible, which is a big part of our distinctiveness here too. So whether listeners and viewers want to use semiotics or not, the confidence we have to be Christian is really important, that we clothe ourselves with Christ and that we have an identity as Christians, as citizens of heaven first, and then everything else second. And I think people respect that. And particularly today, I think it's becoming more and more that if you're in a minority, sure, Christianity is still like laughed at or even people trying to keep it at the margins of the conversation. But if we are confident in Jesus, Kurt Cobain wore his pajamas on stage. Well, why don't we just wear what our comfortable clothing is, which is Jesus, and we be confident in ourselves, and then that leads to us being excited to be going to church again. And if we're excited about going to church, then we're going to ask people to come along because we're confident, and then people might inquire to go, yeah, well, you seem to have found something in your life that means a lot to you. I might like to investigate that. And that's deconstructing what people think church is.
It's like you're saying that like being confident Christians is important to be we're Christians first, but then the things like the semiotics and the T-shirts and the fly mag that we've talked about is to kind of supplement that around that, to continue to build up that confidence. Yeah. Tim, anything else you wanted to react to in reaction to what Stu's saying?
Yeah, I was just thinking a couple of things from when Stu was saying that. So one problematic aspect of trying to fit in with culture as Christians is you have that Keanu Reeves moment where you actually you stand out like a sore thumb and you're not very good at it. The other side of the coin is you become too good at it, and actually the cultural markers and the cultural values take precedence over Christian values. And this is part of what we've been talking about when you get to political and cultural left and right, is that when you have these kind of bundlings going on either side of that political and cultural divide, is that often the non-Christian or non-faith values of either side of that political agenda begin to shape you more than the gospel, or you read the biblical story through the narratives that are predominantly being shaped by either side of that, rather than trying to commit to that evangelical through line and says, no, I'm going to use the Bible as my interpretive framework for everything. And so that can be, it's difficult, if you go right down, say the Christian surfers line, which again, we have a lot of respect for, but when you get to that point where it looks like maybe a particular value of surfing and particular value of Christian conflict with each other, what do you do with that? And the danger is if you've kind of committed to an incarnational ministry that says, well, I'm going to be with this group and I'm going to shape my who I am according to this group, then maybe I will limit some aspect of the Christian story in order to express the values of the non-Christian part of that identity. And so it's trying to work out that balance. Now, the other thing that Stu talked about is when we've made semiotics, they have been ones that maybe culturally resonant might be a word.
That's a good point.
And so,
it's not like a Hessian bag that you wear down the street, is it?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, people wear T-shirts, and so like T-shirts were the thing that we took on. Wearing beaded jewelry was, a particular marker of 90s and early 2000s, sort of skater, surfer culture, which a lot of our people were kind of, that was part of their world. And so we kind of rolled with that, and that's okay. Like we just kind of, it worked in that culture in a way that it may not work today. And so we're not trying to lean really heavily into a culture in an incarnational way that says, well, we're going to become like them in order to reach, earn the right to be heard and therefore taught the gospel to them. But neither are we, wearing Hessian sacks and saying, well, the grunge era wore flannels, so we'll consciously not wear flannels, because we don't want to be
identified. We actually had a Soul Revival flannel, actually.
Did we?
Yeah, we had Soul Revival. One of the girls got a flannel one time and she took it down to Miranda Fair, which is a local supermarket area thing.
Shopping centre,
that's the word. And she just got one of the embroiderers to write Soul Revival on a thing, and we didn't even promote it. Just everyone started going down and getting embroidered shirts. So
and that's
like
that
happen
confidence,
organically. Yeah, it's the confidence. Yeah,
it's that ability to say
Christian confidence. You could call it.
This is who we are. I'm just going to own it. As you say, like that Black Panther impulse of this is who we are. And even if it conflicts with what is seen as some of the powerful cultural forces at work, wherever I happen to be, I'm just going to own it anyway. I'm just going to be confident in who I am. And if that means that I'm in conflict with wearing suits and ties, that's okay. So just trying to work out that balance. And it's constantly changing. We talked about this as well, that the gospel message doesn't change, but because history and culture continues to move on, we're constantly trying to think of what are the ways in which we have to express who we are as Jesus followers in this particular cultural moment.
It's when even with the semiotics, thinking about their changing, is that like if you look at what you're wearing now, for example, Tim, and what we're doing with the apparel now compared to doing a flannel, that makes sense. Is that we're adapting the culture in that way to be able to make sure we're confident Christians, but we're not changing the gospel message. I was just wondering, we keep talking about how we can encourage people to be confident Christians, Stu. Is that one of the reasons why, when the beginning with the Soul Revival Youth Community, you were grappling with what night you should put it on, and you ended up landing on Saturday night?
Good question. Yeah, so it was almost like for me and my friends, we added Christianity last to after we'd done all the other things in the week that we wanted to do. Sure, we went to church on Sunday, but we went to a Bible study if we had time, and then we volunteered to be a youth leader if we had time. So we were uni students and we played sport and we had interests like surfing and stuff like that as well. And after we'd done all those things, if we had time, we'd volunteer to do youth ministry for a while. It was like not really the core of our DNA in our time at our place. Now it might have been different at other times and other places for people, but we sat down one night when we couldn't get our little Soul Revival group going. We were trying really hard just to be cool to start off with, and we were trying to be Keanu Reeves. We thought the problem with the church is we're not cool enough and people think we're daggy, so let's try and be a cool youth group. Now, we might have just been Keanu Reeves and not cool at all, but also we started thinking the whole pursuit of cool is just completely intangible, and while we're trying to work out what the culture's done, by the time we've worked it out, it's moved on to the next thing. So we're constantly behind the times. So we're constantly out of date by trying to copy the culture. So we gave up on that and sat down with the Bible and thought, well, what does God want us to do? And we flicked through the Bible one night and we came across, we were just having a cup of coffee, and there's 4 of us, 4 youth leaders, just trying to, no one had really trained us how to read the Bible properly. So we're just flicking through the Bible looking for verses that we liked. And in God's providence, he sort of had us turn up to Matthew 22, 37 to 40, because we got really struck by that verse, because in that Jesus is asked, what's the most important thing? And his response is, love God and love others. And we thought, we want Jesus to teach us how to love. So we're not really loving God and putting him first like Jesus did, and we're not really loving other people. We're kind of being friendly to them, but we're not really loving them. So we're being friendly, but we're not really being friends. We're not really committed to God, and we're not really committed to other people. We're just going along to an event at church. And we're Christians. We are committed to God, but this was just our own assessment of ourselves, that maybe we got so busy and we were pursuing so many other things in life that our lives had got messy and really complicated, and we wanted to simplify our lives. And so we thought, we were young, and we thought, how are we going to put this into practice? Like, it's one thing to say, let's put God first, but how are we going to do it? And we got a bit excited about doing something. And so someone said, well, Saturday night is the best night of the week. Let's give that to Jesus. And that was a bit countercultural because Christians often do youth leadership on Friday night, but then they'll go out with their friends on a Saturday night and they'll go to parties or catch up with people for dinner or go to a concert or whatever it might be. I'll go to the pub and evangelise the people in the pub, which is fine to evangelise people in a pub, but sometimes I think in our generation we were over-spiritualising that and saying we're going to the pub to evangelise people who don't come to church. And that was quite convenient because we felt like going down and having a beer at the pub and seeing a band there. But we thought Saturday night is a really special night of the week. That's party night. Why don't we give that to Jesus instead of just Sunday, or let's give him the best. And our best was Saturday night. And I don't know if that's the same for people these days, but we thought, let's do that. And we didn't make it a formal church event or a formal church group or anything like that in the early days. It was just, if we're going to be youth leaders on Friday, let's actually stop just running a youth group. Let's be a peer group. Let's be a group of friends with Jesus at our centre, and let's be a family. And so we as youth leaders decided we were going to commit to every Saturday night hanging out with each other, and we're going to open the Bible every Saturday night as a social thing to do, not as a ministry event. And so we hung out in our own time socially around the Bible, and that bled out into all sorts of other things. Like we'd go for a surf and people would just spontaneously turn up in the surf, not dressed up like Keanu Reeves trying to be a cool surfer, but carrying a Bible down to the beach. And we'd have a read before we went into the water. We'd read a psalm or something, and then we'd stand on the beach with our arms around each other and have a pray, and then paddle out. And then we'd be out the back, and sometimes we would talk about God, sometimes we wouldn't, but it was part of our life. We'd go to a coffee shop during the week to meet someone for coffee, and someone would get a Bible out and say, hey, let's have a read. Have you read Jude lately? I've never read it. And then people were doing that sort of thing naturally, because Saturday night was, now we were bringing the gospel into our social life. And so we were compartmentalizing our lives, and it was a confidence. It was, we're Christian, that's who we are first. Why don't we live that out everywhere in our life? And it just multiplied from there. So that confidence was, we started asking other Christian friends to hang out on Saturday night. We asked other non-Christian friends to hang out. So instead of compartmentalizing discipleship and evangelism, a confident Christianity does both at the same time, all the time, I think. So we do church together, and we are the people of God who gather together around the Word of God, and we invite people to come along and hear the message about Jesus. And so preaching was a really big part of the confidence. The Bible was a really important foundation for our friendship, and ministry of evangelism was what we were doing as friends. So some friends gather for a surf, some friends gather to play soccer together, some friends go to watch a movie together. We gathered together to share Jesus with other people, and that was the core of our friendship group. And we went to church on Sunday night, we hung out on Saturday, but pretty soon people were criticising us, going, oh wow, your church group expects a lot of people. But they didn't get it, because we were actually just hanging out as Christian friends. But the bigger it got, the more it ended up looking like a church group, and in the end it did become a church group. But in the early days, no one was paid to do it. We just chose to do it as volunteers. And we did it every week because we wanted this confident consistency as Christians that we call commitment. And we were committed to God, and we were committed to each other as friends, not just as acquaintances. So we wanted to not be just friendly or pleasant strangers with one another. We wanted to be friends. And we actually even started saying, it's really exciting that we're becoming best friends for the gospel. We started using phrases like that. And that's where that confidence started growing, out of the fact that we enjoyed being Christian, and we enjoyed serving Jesus, and we enjoyed doing that together.
Is the idea of a Saturday night was rather kind of countercultural, like you said. Did that help? Do you think that helped with evangelism in terms of people going, what are you doing on a Saturday night? And you're like, well, I'm going to hang out at Soli's, which was what it was at the time.
Yeah, well, we shortened Soul Revival to Soli's, and we said we're hanging at Soli's, and people still went to parties, and sometimes there were issues because sometimes people were like, oh, are we accepted if we don't come every week? And I think we didn't articulate that super well in the early days. Like, we could have done it better. We were reading third place theory that said any community needs to have regulars and irregulars, but we didn't really communicate that part of that theory really effectively early on, because we were just calling people to commitment because we didn't have any regulars. So in the early days, it was trying to build a regular group, and we called that group the Commitments, the Committed Christians. But over time, we got better and better at articulating, you can be a regular in this community or regular. That's cool. And That took a while for us to work that out, but we were just young. I mean, I was 21 when we were trying to do these things, so I don't beat ourselves up too much about that because we're trying to work it out. But that's what we're encouraging our viewers and listeners to do now. Like, what is the current way that we can be confident Christians in our culture today and do it together? Because we don't necessarily have to keep copying what we did in the past or what we're even doing now, because even our expression of Solis now, which is 30 years old, which is pretty exciting actually. Like, I've been hanging out most Saturday nights with Christians as my peer group for the last 30 years and enjoyed it immensely. But it's been a really fun time, and my friends I've made on Saturday nights are probably my closest friends in my life because we're serving Jesus together. And that's not unusual, because C.S. Lewis says that somewhere in one of his writings, he said, you might remember, Tim, because I know you're a fan of C.S. Lewis, but he said something somewhere that when two Christians stop talking about Jesus, then they're not as close as they were when they were talking about Jesus. And I think we don't really equate relationship with the gospel in Western Christianity as much as maybe it would have been in the first century. Because you read a book like Philippians, there's this idea of friendship is a lot deeper in Philippians and the commitment that we have. So Philippians 2 talks about emulating Christ, and friendship used to be, if you're friends with someone, you would emulate them. So if we're friends with Christ, Jesus says, I no longer call you my servants, I call you my friends. And friendship in the first century was, if I'm friends with someone, your friends are my friends and your enemies are my enemies. And I think we've lost a bit of that in our culture. Friends are just like, we like doing stuff together and we like each other. Whereas friendship used to be deeper and more abiding in the first century. And we were trying to re-explore that, I think, to have a deeper commitment in friendship.
Tim, can I get your reflections on having going on a Saturday night? I mean, like, personally, you and I have both grown up in Soul Revival. And at Soul Revival, we decided to start our first gathering on a Saturday night, and I've remained a part of that gathering ever since we started. You, however, go to the Sunday gathering as well. But just looking back, what was Saturday night for you? Was it the same thing that Stu was talking about? Yeah,
it was. I mean, by the time I was going to Saturday nights regularly so it was, Saturday nights were from sort of year 11s up. And so the younger high school crew had youth groups on Friday night, and so but that only went to year 10. And so if you were in year 11, you were invited into the Saturday night group, and part of that, there was a really important friendship aspect of that, which was your leaders who had led you from year 7 through to year 10 were friends with each other, and they were friends with you, and they were saying, hey, now that you're this old or you're in this stage of life, let's continue our friendship. And let me introduce you to the other friends that I've got on Saturday night who are not youth leaders. And so you come into this Saturday night community as a 16, 17-year-old, already being friends with your peers, the leaders that you've had leading you for the last 4 years often, and they are then the pivot point between this other larger community of Saturday night young adults that you may not know them all, but your leaders know you and your leaders know them, and so there's this connection point. So I kind of grew up with that, was fairly well established. So 1999 would have been my first year going to Saturday nights. And I think by that time, there a lot of this language about Saturday night being, setting aside the party night of the week, setting aside the most important social night of the week to hang out with your Christian friends. The idea that we were making a conscious choice to let our discipleship of Jesus and our commitment to our Christian friends being the defining aspect of our calendar was, we were already talking in that kind of language, and still, working out what does that mean permission-wise in terms of, like, I don't need to feel guilty if I go to a party on Saturday night, but I also miss it when I don't, and those kinds of things. So we were trying to work out that balance, and I don't think we always got it right. But that was my experience, was growing up into a already fairly well articulated version of that. And so, that was just, I bought that hook, line and sinker. Like I was just, as in it resonated with me. It made sense to me that these were my most important relationships, and that I was letting Jesus and my discipleship of Jesus in this community shape who my friends were, who I hung out with, how I set my calendar, and all those really important aspects to me as a 17-year-old onwards. And so it made sense that was really important aspect of what I did. And so, I was there nearly every week. As Stu said, you do become best friends with those people. And it's interesting, I've talked to a number of people who were around in that same era who weren't as strongly connected, and they might come once a month or once every 6 weeks and try and drop in. And often their reflection back to me, even now as they reflect back, was I didn't feel connected in that. And I've kind of pondered about that, and I thought, well, maybe there could have been a more, I don't know, I don't think we were unwelcoming, but maybe they experienced a bit of unwelcomeness because they walk into a community where there's lots of regulars and people know each other really well. But there's also that sense, well, of course the people who are there every week are close to each other. Like if you're part of a soccer club and you only turn up to 1 every 4 games, you're not, and no trainings, you're not going to be as closely connected with the rest of your team who are training once or twice a week and playing every week. I mean, that's just how friendships work. That's how relationships work. Yeah,
the proximity thing.
The proximity, yeah. I can't expect to be close friends with someone I see once a month when they're seeing this other person 3 times a week. It's just not going to happen that way. And no matter how welcoming they are, it's just not going to be the same. And so while we did have a lot of permission, absolutely, people could come once every month, once every 6 weeks, totally fine. And hopefully they had a good time. They enjoyed themselves while they were there and they were encouraged and they heard the gospel. But it's just naturally going to be the case that those who did commit to being there every week, who were part of that community and said, this is going to be the primary community that shapes my relationships and my friendship groups, of course they're going to grow deep with each other. And I'm the same as Stu. Like my closest friends are those who we went through that time with and that we're still in relationship with. I think that was really significant. So it's definitely shaped who I am and my understanding of what it means to be part of a community of God's people.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the same for me. The closest relationships and friendships that I have are those that we built on Saturday night, and also at things like Week Away, which we we did every year when we would go on holidays
for a week together.
Which we're about to do in July. My other question around that though was that if we helping people be confident Christians, really trying to spend a lot of time together as Christians, how does because we talk about evangelism we have been talking about evangelism in this season, discipleship and mission working together. How does that fit into what we were doing on a Saturday night?
That's a really good question. Yeah, there was a lot of criticism of us that we were hiding away on Saturday night and we weren't doing any evangelism, and it was Christians doing the usual Christian thing. So a couple of things there. First of all, Soul Revival had the most explosive evangelism come out of Saturday night that I've ever seen. So combined with the chip lunch at school and with the youth group on Friday night and with people feeling confident to ask their friends to come on Saturday night, 80% of the growth of our community was from conversions. And that was really unusual because on the surface that was counterintuitive, because the intuitive Christian thought at the time was the more you spend time together in the church, the less evangelism you're doing. And evangelism, it was fashionable for evangelism to be when I go out with my non-Christian friends
to the pub,
and I hang out with them and I'm in their world, and then I'm going to be able to introduce them to Jesus. But I saw more Christians evangelize to the pub than I saw pub people evangelize to Christianity. So I thought that was broken by the 1990s, and I still think it is. That logic is going to work sometimes, but when you think about it, if I make a friendship with a non-Christian person and I don't introduce them to my church community, and say I do introduce them to Jesus, and then the next step is I say, okay, how about we go to church together? They're going to go, why would I go to church? What's the link there? Because I've experienced my Christian formation with you independently at the pub. What's the church bit? So there's another step that they have to then take. Now, it used to be fashionable for Christians to ask their friends to church, but somewhere along the line, incarnationalism became more fashionable, which was we need to go and be surface to the surface, like Jesus was a Jew to the Jew. So Jesus was incarnate, he became man, and then he became a Jew, and he was a Jew to the Jew, so we should be incarnational and be, some people even go as far as to say, be Jesus to people and go into their communities. But what I say, again, like we've said, we're really big fans of Christian surfers, but one of the problems Christian surfers, I think they've shared with me, they've had over the years, is making the transition for young people who commit to Christ through Christian surfers at the beach to then get them committed to a local church. Because sometimes the Groms who are down at the beach who become Christians at Christian surfers don't always fit into a local church with people who aren't surfers, and so they don't make that connection. So at a time when it's very fashionable to make evangelism something that happens outside of the church, we reintroduce the idea of why don't you invite people to church? And so I think it's not just us hanging out by ourselves. A really important point to make is we were inviting all the time, inviting other Christians to come and hang out with us and inviting non-Christians to come and hang out with us and hear the gospel. We were preaching every Saturday night, which was kind of weird because we'd be in a social context with in our heyday, we were getting over 150 people on a Saturday night sometimes. And we'd do a talk on a Saturday night and some people go, oh, is this church? And I'm like, well, we're preaching the gospel. You don't only preach the gospel from the pulpit in a church service. So we were deconstructing what church was and making it something you could do anywhere. And because we were doing so many social fun stuff on Saturday night, sometimes we'd just hang out. We had a factory we rented for a while. We hung out in a disused church weekly for a while. But even when we're hanging out in those kind of places or people's homes, we would always have out things we do, like we go and do fun stuff. We developed early on this fun idea called the Magical Mystery Tour, which I'm a massive Beatles fan, and one of their worst movies was Magical Mystery Tour, where they got a bus and they drove around and did nothing. And actually the movie's so boring because nothing happens. They just drive around in a bus. And I thought, with my British sensibility and my humour, I thought it'd be hilarious if we just got in a bus and drove around in a bus all night and called it Magical Mystery Tour for a Saturday night. And everyone said, what are we going to do? And I go, I don't know, we'll just get in a bus and drive around and see what happens. And everyone got a name tag, either John, Paul, Ringo or George, and everyone asked their friends. So there's all these long-haired surfers and, people who weren't surfers and all these, teenagers and, over 16 everyone was. But the thing is, see, on Saturday night, so that we could have 16s hanging out with us, we didn't drink. So every Saturday night, that was also very countercultural, that we were exploring what it was to be in a social relationship without alcohol. And anyway, these Magical Mystery Tours just went extreme. They were hilarious. And Jai and Matt, we'll have to do an episode on one, that they just made up these great stories, and it was like a performance art. And we asked other churches to help us to run it, and we'd have 200 people getting on these buses going through. One of them was this back in time thing where we went back to the moment of creation, because we were all excited about Back to the Future still, even though it was a bit of an old movie. And we went back in a time machine and we went back to the Garden of Eden. They decorated the factory up as the Garden of Eden, and we walk into this dark factory, and there was one of the old blokes at church had a really deep voice, and he was reading Genesis 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And all these punks all walk into this room, and there's they've chopped down all these branches and stuff and made a forest in there, and they've put this video on the wall of rainforest, and there was frogs creaking and all sorts of stuff. And we walk in there, and there's a petting zoo in the middle of the room. There's all these sheep and goats and stuff, and we're like, what's going on here? And then we all go in here. It's delightful. We're just having fun as Christians. We created this performance art, and then all of a sudden, out of the darkness, a hardcore band struck up, and we had this massive mosh. There's 200 people moshing in the Garden of Eden. And then we all got back in the bus again, and we had to go back forward in time to the medieval era. So we go down to the river, and there's 3 dragon boats all lined up with flaming torches on them. And we live across the river from a youth work site. And you could see on the other side of the river, they'd set up a medieval banquet. And there were fire eaters and jugglers and a massive bonfire. Yeah. And we paddled across the river, 200 of us in these dragon boats over the river. And we go and we have this big medieval feast at 12 o'clock at night. And everyone had a barbecue chicken each with no knives and forks. And this is unreal. So that's the kind of stuff we used to do. We just had fun. And we went through some other eras. But that's just an example of how you can have a lot of fun when you feel a bit more confident to do more than just turn up to church for an hour a week. And I think it's really interesting that we had lots of non-Christians there at that night, and they were just delighted. And there was no alcohol, but they were having so much fun. on that night. So yeah, that's the kind of stuff that you can do on a Saturday night for evangelism. But also all the talks were very evangelistic. So they're all about who is Jesus. He was the centerpiece of our community, and we celebrated him every Saturday night.
Yeah, and the really significant thing that I think it was obvious to me as a teenager and as growing through was that we talked about this in season 3, if people want to go back and look at all the different type of youth ministry philosophies and paradigms, that the starting point of doing a magical mystery tour, just like many other things we did at Soul Revival, was not how can we run something that non-Christians really want to come to, so that we can have the most awesome thing that a non-Christian 19-year-old can think of doing, and we'll pull off that. And so that's kind of this attractional funnel method type of ministry philosophy, which is let's run something that non-Christians want to come to. And that is just constantly fraught because you're always fighting with culture and you're always trying to create a Christian version of a cultural reality. Like you might have a really great band night or these things. That wasn't the impulse. The impulse was, as Christians, let's really enjoy each other and do the craziest fun that we can do as Christians. And while we're doing it, why don't invite your non-Christians to come too? And so, interestingly, it probably was one of the most fun nights that people, whether they were Christians or not, had that year because it was nutty, it was just absolute random nuttiness, and really, really fun and joyful and.
Everyone was dressed up.
Everyone dressed up.
And we're in public and people looking at us, all these weirdos going,
And one of our members, I think this was the right one, that medieval one was, one of our members came as a caveman, and he just wore underpants with this teddy bear tied around it, and so it looked like he was just wearing this bearskin underpants, and that was the only thing. And it was in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter. It was absolutely freezing.
I thought he was going to get hypothermia.
But in all of this, so I think really interestingly, we didn't start from let's do something that non-Christians really want to come to. It was how do we express who we are as Christians,
a really good point.
and the joy that we have as a Christian community centered around Jesus. And because we love Jesus and because we love each other, we just want to really enjoy each other and our friendship and our who we are as co-adoptees of the Father. And in doing so, actually created something that non-Christians enjoyed. And it was enjoyable because they actually do see, this is countercultural, this is different. I could go with this nutty bunch of young adults on a bus tour all night, and there were other magical mystery tours where pretty much we did nothing. Like it really was just driving to something else and just nothing happened. Yep. And then for an hour.
We spent a lot of time on a bus.
Yeah. And there were those kind of, but you can compare doing that with this joy-filled community who also really love this Jesus that they're reading about in the Bible and talking about really passionately, or contrast that to all the other things I could be doing on a Saturday night. And there was something attractive about that, even though we didn't start from a premise of saying what will be attractional. And I think that's really significant in terms of what Stu said, that evangelistic principle. The evangelism came from inviting people into a group of people who really enjoyed each other and really enjoyed Jesus. And that was how evangelism worked. And as Stu said, it worked. Like people came and they saw this group of people that they were welcomed into, they enjoyed. There was some interesting Jesus talk going on. That's a bit weird. But as they're welcomed into this group, as they're loved and valued and enjoying that space, they then come to want to listen to, well, who is this Jesus that's reshaping these people's lives? Why would these people recommit their most important night socially of the week to doing this together? And it starts to break down some of those barriers that people might have. It starts to open up the conversations. And because we would do, even just a normal Saturday night would be a long time, hours and hours with each other. And so you've got time and space to have those conversations, and people can raise questions and go, look, I really like what you guys do. This is a really fun space. I like the factory. I love this. I love being able to come and just skate around. But I'm not quite sure about why Christians, hate gays. Like, can you talk me through that? And because we've got hours with each other, we can sit down and say, oh, okay, well, that's really interesting. We don't, actually. Let's try and explore why you might think that. What are the messages you've heard? Let me take us to the Bible. And you've got this time to do that and to be able to explain. They can say, I can see now that you don't hate gays. I can see where that comes from. And they may end up still not agreeing with us, and that's fine. Or they may just continue to shape their understanding of who Jesus is and who Jesus' people are. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's really fun. I think the idea too of Magical Mystery Tour, another thing to mention is that we would do a talk every Saturday night, and on the mystery tour we'd do it publicly. So I remember standing up in Cronulla, and Tim Baldwin got up on a rock and started preaching, and there's 120 of us standing around all in fancy dress, and all these people came over, and what's going on here? It was so much fun, and people were heckling, and Tim was loving it, and he was just bantering with people and sharing the gospel in a park, and then we all disappeared. And it was like, what happened there? Like, that must have been pretty funny. And there were guys around the edges of our group just keeping an eye out for anybody that might be unsavoury or might get a bit hectic. But yeah, we did that in Circular Quay one night. We've been out together as a community, and where we go, we speak. Our youth group sometimes used to go ice skating, and they'd sit around in a corner and they'd have a talk in public, and it just builds that confidence for the young people. And I think it's really interesting too that that idea of being in relationship with people, not just being pleasant strangers with them, that I'm actually keen to dig in with you and share my life with you is a really good thing. Doing that long-term, low-key and relationally. And I think one of the biggest problems we have in our community today is loneliness, and people don't have anywhere to belong. So when there's a group of people who say, you can belong by just walking through the door, and as a Christian, if you're a Christian, the Holy Spirit is already, you got the Holy Spirit, I got the Holy Spirit. Jesus has reconciled us through the cross to be brothers and sisters. Let's express that. And then non-Christian people who come and see that go, wow, the difference Jesus has made to you is something that I'm fascinated by. And then they hear the gospel and repent and believe. It's really beautiful. So, and it wouldn't be, what we're talking about too is not just back in the 90s. We still do that today, and it's still, we call it late night now. Like I said earlier, like things migrate and change. We used to call it Solies, now we call it late night. And I don't think Saturday night would be Saturday night without late night, because we'd just have a church service and dinner, and then we'd all go home. But there's a big group of people, no matter what age they are, that sometimes stay till 1 a.m. just hanging out with each other, and it builds really strong relationships. But yeah, if someone's got a party or they're going away, they do that too. But the regularity of it is important. And
we heard a number of weeks back now, but when we had a crossover episode here with the Chip Lunch, and it was me, Ethan, and Hudson. Chatting, and we're just talking about how for Hudson, that who is a high schooler now, that late night is something that he feels confident bringing his friends to, and his friends are coming and sitting in amongst, and they're not Christians, and yet they're coming to late night to experience this community of Jesus-shaped people, and just sort of seeing what that's like, and thinking about, okay, well, this is what Hudson means when Hudson says he's a Christian, and then I come to this late night gathering and I see all these people interacting like this, and this is how they treat each other, and this is what they believe, and this is the talk that they give, and that's really interesting to me. And so there is that long-term, low-key, relational discipleship and mission, which invites people in to see the group. And I think that also, there's a theological depth there about how Jesus makes us into a body, that we're not all these little individuals going off doing our own little evangelism. We're actually, God purposely knits us into the body, the community of Christ in the local context, and the local church is where the action is. And so it makes sense that we would invite people into that reality to, as they investigate in Jesus, you're having conversations with your schoolmates, your uni mates, your work colleagues, your next door neighbours, your barber, whoever it happens to be, and you say, well, you want to know more about Jesus? Yes, I can sit down and read the Bible with you. That's a really helpful way of helping people do understand who Jesus is. But also, come and hang out with my community, and then you'll see what the Jesus-shaped community looks like and what they do. And so I think having lots of ways in which we can evangelise people and invite people to see who Jesus is and who his people are is really helpful.
Did you have something to add to that, Stu? I was just thinking, you were talking about Hudson. I think one of the first times his non-Christian friends came was when we went from here. We were here at Sorrel at Kirrawee, and we took. I think we were making. what's the right? It's not crumpets. I can't think of what it was, but Waffles. Thank you. But some of the boys brought some lounges across the road to the park, and then your son Ethan ran a extension cord from the South Village, like it's a large unit development, from the lobby across a road, so we could heat up some waffles.
Yeah, it was a pathway.
Yeah, it went across a pathway that goes near the road, those boys turned up and like, I better get them some waffles, see if they want some waffles. And then I went to go and do it, and there was already 3 guys already in the process of doing that for them. So I think
waffles in the middle of a park with lounges is very survival.
At like 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah, very survival.
Yeah. So that was just one of the examples of what you guys are talking about.
And it's cool seeing a 17-year-old still vibing that 30 years later after we first started.
That it's still cool to just hang out.
It's still cool to hang out. Yeah.
We've talked about that in terms of building relationships and things like that. One other thing I wanted to ask you about Soul Revival across the years was building relationships with other churches and other youth ministries that began with, and then other churches later on. Just what was the thinking behind that? We've talked about it in previous episodes, but it was also to build relationships with other churches in order to, again, this is my guess, is to help people again be confident being Christians, and then to be able to evangelize to the areas of where they were as a church.
And being friends was a big thing for us. I mean, some people have pushed back on our use of friendship, but when we said to I think it's an ecclesial category because Jesus says, "I call you my friends," but also it's not. We never use it and not use the other ecclesial categories like family or being a wall, being a body. We use all those terms too, metaphors that are in the Bible to explain the church. But the friendship thing for us was really powerful, particularly in the 90s. And I think up until today, because in Australia anyway, I think amongst a lot of the people that I know, family isn't a major part of their life. For some of you listening, it will be, but for a lot of Australians, family is an excuse not to actually have much relationship with someone. There's a lot of families that just meet at Christmas. The extended family will get together, call themselves family, aunties and uncles and whatever, but they're not actually super close. And I think some young people particularly hear us say family and they abide those categories and they think, all these adults in the church are like my aunties and uncles who I don't really have a relationship with. I just turn up to Christmas once a year. So I'll go to church with them, but I don't really get to know them. But then when you use the word friend, people go, wow, you're actually wanting to be friends with each other in the church. That's very challenging because I think a lot of people find that as a deeper category. So with regard to relationships within the church, we're trying to be friends. And then with other churches, we want to be friends with other churches too, because our local church is where we do the one another passages and we bear one another's burdens and we care for each other. But we're connected to the Catholic Church, not the Roman Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church that is universal church right around the world. And we're part of the body of Christ that goes through time as well, and we'll all be gathered together in heaven together one day. So it'd be good to express that as much as we can in this fallen, sinful world too. So we just had this vibe of wanting to be friends with other churches, and some wanted to be friends back, which we found quite delightful. So we used to have get-togethers in the 90s with Menai Anglican and Narrabeen Anglican, and we started a thing called the Treehouse where we all hung out and we did a festival once a year. That was a lot of fun. We shared leadership resources, ideas, programs, but mainly just loved each other. And we all really loved that. And then in 2008, we had a similar vibe with a thing we called the Jesus Movement, where we got about 20 churches together that were even not just Anglican churches, but also Baptist and Presbyterian and others. And we had a lot of fun with those days as well. When we met our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, they wanted to be friends with us, and they had this great idea called River Convention, which was they'd go around to all these country towns in each long weekend and have a Christian convention. So we used to tag along and really enjoy that. And so friendships with other churches has also been a really big part of our DNA, because some people say, well, why would you be friends with another church? And our answer was, why wouldn't you be friends with another church? It's heaps of fun.
What's the difference between, we talked about like not just having an attractional event, but at those times we did have big events. What do you think that the difference is between those two when we met all together as churches compared to making, I'm probably going to say the difference here, an attractional event that's meant to appeal to non-Christians.
Yeah. So, I mean, Tim might want to say something about this because he's been reading a bit about this lately, but we're tending to do less and less big things together. We've got less confidence to do that. But we still like doing that sort of thing because it's like a big party. The other thing that's really cool about it is that when you get together with other Christians, if you go to a big event with a strong identity as a local church, you can take a small youth group to a big event and not fear that your kids are going to want to go to another church because it's bigger. It's actually, we're going as committed members of Guymer Anglican or Soul Revival or whatever it might be to this big event. And we're going to be both at the same time. We're going to be part of this bigger group and be our group. And we found that when we do it that way, that is really powerful. The other thing is, like Tim said earlier, that if you put on a big concert and try and pretend and do bait and switch, ask your friends to a concert and then, by the way, now you're here, I'm going to share a message with you and do you want to fill in a card and become a Christian? People don't like that. But if kids go and say, our church is running a concert, which is a Christian concert, and we're going to go to a Christian community and really enjoy it, and we're going to have a dance or a mosh or whatever it might be. Back in the day, those words were more relevant, but just showing my age, I suppose. But the consequence was kids would go, I might come and check out how you Christians do that. Like, what does that look like when you guys do it? And when they came along, we talked before about minority being about 10% actually starts changing things. There's actually a theory of a significant minority. So they reckon that political scientists say that 10% of a community can shape a whole community. So if you've got at least 10% of confident Christians at a band night and you say, this is a Christian event, we're going to hear some music, we're also going to open the Bible and have a read, you say that up front to everyone, they know what they're coming to get. It's not bait and switch, they come along. And then when the band has the first set, you just go nuts and enjoy it. And then part of the night is expected to be, Stewie's going to share a message, he gets up with the Bible and he gets the Bible out. And if 10% of the room sit down straight away and they're confident Christians and they're not afraid of looking like jerks in front of their non-Christian friends and they all sit down, they'll set the culture and the rest of the people there will all sit down. And I've had 25-minute, 30-minute talks at a concert where people have loved it and they've bantered and they've yelled out stuff and have a laugh about it. And unfortunately that sort of world is where I cut my teeth on preaching. So sometimes people say at church I go on a bit long and sometimes tell a few stories. But when you're in a rock concert with 400 people and you're giving a gospel message, they're not keen to hear an introduction, 3 points and a conclusion. So, I do understand that a lot of Christians love structure and a short sermon, but I also think to engage people and engage their minds and their hearts, it's really exciting to have fun with a talk and really go for it. And it's not been uncommon for us to have lots of people become Christians in a band night because they've just loved the whole thing because it's not compartmentalized. It's even the night, it just flows that we're Christians, we talk about Jesus. That's what, and people want to know that. Like, okay, where did all this come from? I'm seeing all these different kinds of people. I mean, I don't know when the Cronulla riots were. It was 2004 or something.
2005.
Well, 2005, quick story. 2005, the night before the Cronulla, if you haven't heard of the Cronulla riots, very sad period of time in Sutherland Shire where we come from, where there was a whole heap of mostly white men in the Shire had a riot down at Cronulla Beach because they wanted to get rid of all the people from outside of the Shire from coming to the beach, particularly of other ethnicities. It was a real shameful day in Sutherland Shire history, and actually to this day if you say you're from Cronulla, people still go, Cronulla riots. So that was a shameful day. Well, that happened on a Sunday. The irony is that the night before that we were having a Soul Revival night where we'd invited some of our friends from other churches to come and have a hip-hop concert together. Now, we didn't usually have hip-hop in the Shire at the time, and that was new to a lot of us. So we had a lot of Christian friends from Western Sydney, Christian friends from Aboriginal communities. There were Lebanese people there were Aboriginal people there were Islanders there were white people there, and we're all having this big concert together, having a great Christian party together with all these churches, probably 100 of us. And anyway, people's phones started pinging that night, people getting SMS messages saying people were going down to Cronulla and they were going to demonstrate and take the beach back, something like that. And people were saying, hey, Stu, are you getting these messages? And I hadn't got one, but the teenagers were like, look, everyone's talking about going down the beach to have a riot. And my my thought was, I was looking around the room going, why would that happen? That's not going to happen. And I'm looking around the room, there's Aboriginal people and Lebanese people and there's Islanders and white people and Asian people, and we're all enjoying a hip hop night together in the name of Jesus. And it was like heaven to me. I'm loving this with the friendships with these different churches. And I just thought, oh, look, I think these guys must be just having a go. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. And I remember my shock and horror the next day when it was on TV. And I remember turning on TV and here's this live footage of this riot down at Cronulla. And I was just shocked and really saddened. But I also felt that very weekend, there was one of the most multicultural gatherings that our community had in the Sutherland Shire in the name of Jesus. And I couldn't think of a starker contrast between the Christian church in the Sutherland Shire and the secular place that it was at back then. It was chalk and cheese. And I think that's the difference a confident, loving community makes when we hear the message of the gospel and we seek to express it and we invite people to come to it. It is something we can invite people to see. It is really important that we don't lose confidence in the local church and we get excited about gathering together. However people who are listening or watching end up doing that, do it as it's authentic in your place, but do it confidently in the name of Jesus and preach the gospel and share the love of Jesus and the truth of Jesus, person to person, generation to generation, culture to culture, and place to place. It's a very exciting and important message that we have in our culture, particularly for us in the Sutherland Shire.
So that's probably a good place to wrap it up. I think what we could say, though, is that what's emerged from this podcast is trying to encourage each other to be confident Christians. And I think I have to count you as two people who have done that for myself, so thank you very much for that. And I think I think that's something that hopefully our listeners and viewers can really take heart from as well and really get behind. So thank you for today, guys. It's been a really enjoyable conversation. Thank you to everyone that's also been listening. Thank you also to our producer Dave, who hangs around at the back, is always ready to go. He's even looking a bit crook today, so he's still ready, still behind the camera making it happen. If you are interested in looking at any of those semiotics that we did talk about today, particularly with Soul Revival, you can check out soulrevival.shop. All of our proceeds from the sales on that shop go to our Indigenous ministry partners, as Stu said earlier. You can also, if you just want to add to the conversation, email me at joel@shockabsorber.com.au. Definitely subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, whether it's on YouTube or your favourite podcast app. And check out the Discord link. We'd love to continue the conversation on there as well. Having said that, we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to confident Christians in my life. And we'll finish with the one way.
One way.
One way.